The entire story of the Art of War documentary begins in a period of profound political unrest in ancient China. In 771 BC, the collapse of the Western Zhou dynasty marked the end of centralized authority, as the capital was sacked and the king was forced to retreat eastward. Regional states emerged from the resulting power vacuum, each competing for survival and dominance. Warfare became a constant, and the need for an effective strategy transformed from a theoretical concept into a practical necessity. Amid this fragmented landscape, leaders faced unprecedented challenges: organizing armies, maintaining discipline, provisioning troops, and navigating alliances and rivalries. Military success required more than brute force. It demanded observation, analysis, and planning. The intellectual groundwork laid during these early centuries provided the context in which strategic principles, later codified in the art of war, would develop. This is the beginning of the entire story of the art of war documented for historical purposes. In 771 BC, the structure that had defined China for centuries fractured. The Western Zhou dynasty, which had ruled since roughly 1046 BC, collapsed under the weight of internal betrayal and external assault. What had once been the most stable and ritualized kingdom in East Asia was now a map of chaos. This event marks not only the end of the Western Zhou, but also the beginning of China's long transition toward the world that would produce the art of war. The Zhou kings had maintained order through a feudal system known as the Fengjin structure. Power was distributed among hereditary lords who governed their own regions, but owed loyalty and military support to the Zhou king. This balance had worked as long as the royal house in Haojing, near modern Xi'an, retained moral authority, known as the Mandate of Heaven. Yet by the late 9th century BC, that legitimacy had weakened. The Zhou court became divided between competing noble clans, and corruption eroded trust in the king's rule. The final collapse began during the reign of King Yu of Zhou, r. 781 to 771 BC. He favored his concubine Bao Si, demoting his lawful queen and disinheriting their son. This domestic scandal grew into a political crisis. The queen's father, the powerful Marquis of Shun, allied with the Qian nomads, a tribal confederation from the northwestern frontier, to punish the king. In 771 BC, their combined forces attacked the Zhou capital at Haojing. The city was burned, King Yu was killed, and the royal court was forced to flee eastward. This moment is not merely gossip from palace intrigue. It marks the end of centralized power in ancient China. With the capital destroyed, the Zhou dynasty re-established itself in Luoyang, initiating the Eastern Zhou period. The dynasty survived in name, but real power slipped to regional lords who now acted as sovereigns. The once unified realm had become a mosaic of independent states. Historians view this as the collapse of ritual authority and the birth of a new political reality, one defined by diplomacy, alliances, espionage, and war. The feudal system that had maintained relative peace under the early Zhou kings became the foundation for centuries of rivalry. Each state retained fragments of Zhou ritual culture but adapted them to its own ambitions. Warfare became more organized, and military leaders began to eclipse hereditary nobles. This fragmentation also reshaped how the Chinese understood order and survival. The Mandate of Heaven, once seen as a guarantee of divine legitimacy, now appeared conditional. Rulers began to study power itself, how to acquire it, sustain it, and defend it. Over time, This shift in thinking led to the rise of strategic reasoning, the intellectual soil from which the art of war would eventually emerge. The geopolitical map of the late 8th century BC changed quickly. Regional states such as Jin, Qi, Shu, Qian, and Yin began expanding their territories. Smaller states were absorbed, and alliances shifted constantly. Military conflict became the default method of negotiation. Armies grew larger and more disciplined. Bronze weapons gave way to iron tools and weapons, revolutionizing agriculture and warfare alike. These developments pushed ancient China into a more interconnected, competitive era. What was lost in this transition was not just central authority, but also the old Zhou worldview. The early Zhou kings had ruled through a moral and ritual code known as Li, a system emphasizing hierarchy, duty, and reverence for ancestors. After 771 BC, the relevance of Li declined as practical survival took precedence over inherited virtue. This new world favored cunning over tradition, strategy over ceremony, and intelligence over inheritance. The seeds of the art of war lay here. In a time when rulers could no longer rely on divine favor alone to hold power. Archaeological evidence supports this shift. Burial sites from the late Western Zhou show declining opulence in royal tombs compared to earlier centuries. Bronze inscriptions, once full of moral proclamations, increasingly reference military service and feudal obligations. The cultural focus had turned from piety to pragmatism. When King Ping of Zhou moved the capital east to Luoyang in 770 BC, the dynasty entered its Eastern Zhou phase, which historians later divide into two epochs: the Spring and Autumn period, 770 to 476 BC, and the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC. Together, these represent more than 5 centuries of almost constant power struggle. For documentary purposes, 771 BC is the definitive starting line, the moment when order dissolved and strategy became the only path to survival. Every major development that followed, from the rise of regional warlords to the codification of military doctrine, traces back to this collapse. It is crucial to recognize that the fall of the Western Zhou did not create chaos overnight. Many of the old systems persisted regionally, and the Zhou kings continued to hold ceremonial authority for centuries. But their control was symbolic. Real governance now depended on a ruler's ability to command armies, manage alliances, and manipulate rivals. The shift was gradual but irreversible. This transformation also sparked the intellectual evolution of ancient China. As competing states tried to justify their power, scholars and ministers began analyzing politics as a human craft rather than a divine order. The early thinkers of this period, precursors to Confucius, Laozi, and later military theorists, lived in an age when wisdom equaled survival. For them, knowledge was not a moral exercise but a strategic necessity. By 771 BC, the Zhou world had effectively split into a patchwork of independent states loosely bound by ritual recognition of the Zhou king. Yet each lord now minted his own coins, commanded his own army, and managed his own bureaucracy. The scale of warfare increased dramatically. The weapons of this era, chariots, bronze-tipped spears, and early crossbows, began to define the nature of Chinese combat. Strategy evolved beyond simple battlefield tactics to include logistics, deception, and timing. The fall of the Western Zhou thus marks the beginning of a new intellectual order. What was once a world of ceremonial warfare between nobles became a brutal competition for supremacy. In this environment, abstract concepts such as deception, adaptability, and intelligence gained practical meaning. The lessons that would later appear in the art of war: to subdue the enemy without fighting, to exploit weakness rather than meet strength directly, had their origins in the survival instincts of this fractured age. By the end of this first century of decline, around 700 BC, the Zhou king was largely a symbolic figure, issuing titles but commanding no armies. The states of Qi, Jin, Chu, and Qian had emerged as dominant regional powers. The wars they fought were no longer simple contests of honor, but calculated campaigns for resources, trade routes, and legitimacy. Thus, 771 BC is not simply a date of destruction. It is the beginning of strategic consciousness in Chinese civilization. The collapse of the Zhou order forced thinkers and rulers alike to confront a new question. If divine mandate no longer guaranteed stability, what could? The answer, as history would show, was strategy, a discipline that would define Chinese statecraft for millennia. This is the foundation of the entire story of Sun Tzu's art of war. Before Sun Wu ever set foot in the court of Wu, before the book itself existed, the world that required it had already been born, forged in the collapse of order. Following the collapse of the Western Zhou in 771 BC, the political landscape of China entered a period defined by fragmentation and the consolidation of regional power. The Zhou dynasty continued to exist in name with the establishment of the Eastern Zhou capital at Luoyang, but the real power shifted decisively to regional lords. These states, including Qi, Jin, Chu, Wu, and Yu, began asserting authority independently, establishing military structures, administrative systems, and economic bases that would sustain their autonomy and expansion. The state of Qi, located in the modern Shandong region, leveraged its fertile plains and maritime access to develop agriculture and trade. Its rulers were among the first to institutionalize bureaucratic management of resources, using tax collection and land administration to fund armies. Similarly, the state of Jin, in the northern plains, relied on its strong chariot-based military and aristocratic clans to dominate surrounding territories. Jin's military organization was structured around hereditary nobility, but it increasingly relied on professional warriors trained for both field engagements and border defense. To the south, the state of Chu controlled vast, less densely populated lands along the Yangtze River. Chu maintained a mixture of indigenous tribal structures and Zhou administrative practices, adapting them to local conditions. Its large population base and control over key rivers enabled it to field significant armies. Chu also developed early fortifications along its borders, signaling a shift from ritualized defense to strategic preparation against both internal rebellion and external attack. In the southeastern region, the states of Wu and Yu emerged as maritime powers. Wu's location on the lower Yangtze allowed for riverine and naval development, enabling control of trade routes and supply lines. Yu, neighboring Wu, shared similar advantages and participated in both commercial and military exchanges with Wu. These states, while culturally distinct from the northern Zhou-centered states, increasingly interacted through alliances, conflicts, and strategic marriages, shaping the pattern of interstate relations in early Eastern Zhou China. The adoption of iron technology was transformative during this century. While bronze remained in ceremonial and elite contexts, iron tools and weapons became widespread, improving both agriculture and military capability. Iron plows increased productivity, supporting larger populations and enabling states to maintain standing armies. Iron swords, spears, and arrowheads enhanced battlefield lethality and contributed to the professionalization of military forces. Chariots continued to play a role, but infantry units equipped with iron weapons grew in importance, reflecting the evolving nature of warfare. Population growth in these regions also necessitated administrative reforms. Local governance became more structured, with appointed officials overseeing taxation, labor, and conscription. These developments enabled states to mobilize resources efficiently, sustaining larger, better-trained armies. Military leadership began to emphasize skill, discipline, and strategic planning rather than purely aristocratic status, signaling the rise of professional generals as distinct figures from noble lineages. Trade networks expanded in parallel with these political changes. States such as Qi and Chu established overland and riverine trade routes, exchanging agricultural products, raw materials, and early manufactured goods. The availability of resources allowed for investment in military infrastructure, including walls, fortresses, and logistics networks. Control of these networks became a key factor in state survival and expansion, creating incentives for calculated military campaigns rather than ad hoc skirmishes. Diplomatic engagement evolved alongside military organization. States engaged in alliances and rivalries, often negotiating marriages, tribute, and territorial agreements. Diplomacy required careful assessment of relative power, timing, and the capacity to respond to shifting circumstances. This period witnessed the emergence of strategic thinking as a practical necessity. Rulers and advisors recognized that survival depended on both force and foresight. The proliferation of regional conflicts between 770 and 700 BC provided repeated opportunities to test organizational reforms. Battles were increasingly planned, incorporating reconnaissance, supply lines, and coordinated maneuvers between infantry, chariot units, and riverine forces in southern states. Military outcomes were directly tied to administrative efficiency and logistical support, not merely the valor of individual combatants. States that adapted to these requirements consolidated their power, while those that failed faced annexation or decline. By 700 BC, the landscape of Eastern Zhou China had been redefined. The central authority of the Zhou king existed largely as a symbolic figurehead, granting legitimacy to regional rulers without controlling military action. Authority was exercised at the state level, and power rested with those capable of mobilizing, sustaining, and strategically employing military forces. The emergence of professional military leaders and bureaucrats marked a significant transformation in Chinese political culture, laying the groundwork for the intellectual codification of strategy. This century-long transition also influenced the evolution of strategic thought. Rulers, advisors, and military leaders began documenting lessons learned from conflict, evaluating the effectiveness of troop deployment, fortification, and resource management. Early records indicate an increasing attention to reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and deception as components of successful campaigns. While not yet systematized into a formal text, these practices represent the practical foundations upon which later military treatises, including the art of war, would be constructed. The rise of the warlords during this period demonstrates the interdependence of military capacity, economic management, and political legitimacy. Each state's ability to field armies, maintain internal stability, and respond to rivals determined its survival. Military engagement was no longer incidental. It was a central factor in statecraft. The cumulative experiences of these early Eastern Zhou states informed later theorists who would codify principles of strategic advantage, efficiency, and the use of intelligence to outmaneuver opponents. By the close of this period, the Eastern Zhou political environment had become highly competitive and structured, characterized by permanent armies, centralized administration, and evolving warfare technology. These conditions created the context in which military strategy became both necessary and sophisticated. Rulers recognized that the success of their states depended on the calculated application of force, resource allocation, and political acumen. The rise of these warlords also set the stage for intellectual developments. As states competed, advisors and officials began to formalize observations about leadership, logistics, and battlefield tactics. These discussions were not theoretical exercises. They were responses to concrete challenges of governance, survival, and expansion. The strategies that emerged were grounded in observation and practical application, forming the conceptual framework that would later be integrated into comprehensive military texts. The consolidation and competition among Qi, Jin, Chu, Wu, and Yu illustrate the complexity of early Eastern Zhou politics. States were no longer uniform in culture or organization. Regional differences required adaptive approaches to administration, diplomacy, and warfare. The variability in terrain, resources, and population distribution forced leaders to innovate, experiment with troop formations, and coordinate multi-pronged campaigns. This adaptive environment was central to the evolution of strategic principles that emphasized flexibility, economy of force, and the exploitation of relative advantage. Between 700 and 600 BC, Eastern Zhou China experienced a transformation that reshaped the political, military, and administrative structures of the region. The collapse of central authority after the fall of the Western Zhou in 771 BC had created a fragmented political landscape dominated by independent regional states. These states, including Qi, Jin, Chu, Wu, Yu, and Qin, were engaged in constant competition for territory, resources, and influence. The period is characterized by institutional consolidation, strategic innovation, and the emergence of practices that would later underpin formalized military doctrine. One of the defining features of this century was the institutionalization of governance and administration within these regional states. Rulers recognized that survival depended on the efficient organization of resources, taxation, and labor. States such as Qi in the east and Jin in the north implemented bureaucratic reforms to standardize land administration and revenue collection. Local officials were appointed to manage agricultural production, maintain records, and oversee conscription. The ability to mobilize manpower systematically allowed states to sustain larger, more permanent armies, creating a structural advantage in conflicts with neighboring powers. The rise of professional military leadership also became evident during this period. While earlier Zhou armies were often led by hereditary nobles with limited training, the pressures of constant interstate warfare necessitated commanders who understood strategy, discipline, and logistics. Generals were increasingly selected for competence rather than lineage, and their roles extended beyond the battlefield to encompass intelligence gathering, troop organization, and coordination of supply lines. This professionalization marked a key step toward the development of military thought as a systematic discipline. The technological and tactical landscape of the period also evolved. The widespread use of iron weapons replaced many bronze implements, offering superior strength and durability for swords, spears, and arrowheads. Iron plows improved agricultural productivity, supporting larger populations and enabling sustained military campaigns. Chariots remained an important tactical component, particularly in northern states, but infantry equipped with iron weaponry increasingly dominated the battlefield. The combination of advanced metallurgy and organized armies facilitated complex operations, including coordinated attacks, sieges, and multi-state campaigns. Strategically, this century witnessed the formalization of warfare practices. States began to recognize the importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and planning. Battles were no longer solely determined by the courage or numbers of troops, but by preparation, terrain analysis, and the timing of maneuvers. For example, Jin frequently conducted campaigns that involved careful staging of forces and deployment of chariots to exploit enemy weaknesses, while Qi emphasized the integration of naval and land operations along its rivers and coastal regions. Chu, with its extensive river networks, adapted fortification techniques and defensive strategies suitable for controlling larger, sparsely populated territories. The political and diplomatic dimensions of this era were closely intertwined with military developments. Alliances were formed and broken based on shifting balances of power, and diplomacy required careful assessment of both internal and external conditions. States often employed marriages, tributes, and negotiated border agreements as tools to manage rivalries. Advisors to rulers increasingly contributed analyses of state capabilities, potential threats, and optimal timing for campaigns. These developments represent the emergence of strategic thinking as a practical necessity in governance. Economic structures played a central role in supporting military and administrative reforms. Agriculture remained the primary source of wealth, but trade networks expanded both within and between states. Qi, positioned along the eastern coast, developed maritime trade routes, facilitating the exchange of iron, salt, grain, and other commodities. The accumulation of resources enabled sustained military production, including weapons, armor, and infrastructure such as roads and fortifications. The ability to control and mobilize these resources became a determining factor in state survival and expansion. Population dynamics also influenced political and military organization. Larger populations allowed for the maintenance of standing armies, specialized units, and labor forces for infrastructure projects. States with the capacity to conscript, train, and supply large numbers of soldiers held significant advantages in interstate conflicts. Census records and bronze inscriptions from this period indicate increasing attention to population management and administrative oversight, reflecting the growing complexity of statecraft. The cultural and intellectual climate of the century provided a foundation for systematic analysis of human behavior, leadership, and conflict. The fragmentation of power and continuous military engagement prompted early theorists to observe patterns of victory and defeat, noting the relationships between morale, discipline, logistics, and strategic advantage. While no comprehensive treatises yet existed, These observations circulated among officials and military leaders, forming the practical knowledge base that would later be formalized in works such as The Art of War. Interstate warfare during this period was also shaped by geography. Northern states such as Jin and Qin relied on plains and river systems for rapid troop movements, while southern states like Chu, Wu, and Yu adapted to hilly and riverine terrain, developing specialized tactics for defense and maneuvering. Control of strategic locations, such as river crossings, mountain passes, and trade hubs, became central to military planning. These considerations reinforced the emerging recognition that a successful strategy required flexibility, situational awareness, and anticipation of enemy responses. The consolidation of political and military institutions was accompanied by ritual and legal adaptations. Although the Zhou kings retained symbolic authority, regional rulers increasingly codified laws to regulate military service, property rights, and succession. Ceremonial practices continued to confer legitimacy, but practical enforcement relied on administrative capacity and coercive power. Legal and organizational innovations allowed states to stabilize internally while preparing for external conflict, further emphasizing the role of disciplined governance in achieving strategic objectives. This century also marks the early stages of interconnected intelligence networks. States maintained networks of informants, scouts, and messengers to monitor rivals' activities. Knowledge of enemy troop movements, alliances, and supply lines became critical for planning campaigns. The systematic collection and analysis of information laid the groundwork for principles of deception, surprise, and operational flexibility that would later be codified in military texts. By 600 BC, the Eastern Zhou world had developed a highly structured and competitive political system. States operated as autonomous entities with professional militaries, organized administration, and established economic and logistical frameworks. Warfare was no longer sporadic. It was a continuous, organized process involving planning, resource management, and strategic execution. Military leadership required technical knowledge, organizational skill, and political acumen, marking the transition from ritualized conflict to strategic science. The developments of this century provided the environment in which later military theorists would operate. The combination of fragmented political authority, professionalized armies, administrative sophistication, and early strategic analysis created a context where systematic observation of warfare was both necessary and possible. The experiences of Qi, Jin, Chu, Wu, Yu, and other states established enduring principles regarding force allocation, resource mobilization, and the importance of adaptability in response to dynamic conditions. Between 600 and 520 BC, the state of Wu emerged as a distinct political and military power in the southeastern region of Eastern Zhou China. Located along the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, Wu was geographically and culturally distinct from the northern Zhou-influenced states such as Jin and Qi. Its development illustrates the adaptive strategies regional powers employed during the Eastern Zhou period, combining indigenous practices with innovations borrowed from neighboring states. This period also set the stage for the rise of military thinkers who would later influence the codification of strategic principles, including those attributed to Sun Wu or Sun Tzu. Wu's location along rivers, lakes, and marshlands created both opportunities and challenges. The abundance of waterways facilitated trade, transport, and communication, but also required specialized military techniques. Wu rulers invested in naval capabilities, developing fleets for both transportation and combat. Control of the river systems allowed Wu to secure its economic base, monitor borders, and project power into neighboring regions. Waterborne operations became integral to the state's defense and its ability to engage in offensive campaigns. The state of Yu, Wu's immediate neighbor to the south, maintained a similar riverine and maritime environment. The interaction between Wu and Yu included both competition and cultural exchange. Warfare between the two states required adaptation to local terrain, the coordination of naval and infantry units, and intelligence gathering to anticipate enemy movements. Wu's exposure to Yu's strategies encouraged experimentation with military organization, logistical planning, and the integration of new tactics suitable for marshland and riverine combat. In the northern part of the state, Wu had contact with Chu, a large and resource-rich state along the middle Yangtze. Chu represented a model of hierarchical governance, large-scale military mobilization, and administrative sophistication. Wu rulers adopted elements of Chu's military organization, including training regimes, troop discipline, and structured command hierarchies. These adaptations reflect the broader trend of cultural and technological exchange among Eastern Zhou states, whereby peripheral states selectively borrowed methods to enhance their competitive advantage. During this period, military innovation was a key factor in state consolidation. Wu invested in fortifications, constructing defensive works along its northern borders to protect against incursions from Chu and other regional powers. The state's military hierarchy became increasingly professionalized. Officers were appointed based on skill, experience, and knowledge of terrain, rather than solely on noble lineage. Troops were trained in both infantry and riverine operations, reflecting the complex geography of the region. Standardized weaponry and the introduction of iron arms further enhanced Wu's military capacity. Political organization in Wu followed a combination of hereditary rulership and meritocratic appointments. While the king retained ultimate authority, administrative positions were increasingly filled by individuals demonstrating competence in logistics, strategy, or governance. Land distribution and agricultural management were key components of sustaining the army. The state's capacity to organize resources efficiently allowed for prolonged campaigns, rapid mobilization, and resilience against external pressures. Trade and economic development were closely linked to military strength. Wu engaged in commerce with northern states through riverine and overland routes, exchanging rice, timber, iron implements, and other commodities. Access to these resources enabled the state to support larger armies and invest in infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and storage facilities. The ability to integrate economic management with military planning exemplified a growing understanding of the interdependence of statecraft, logistics, and warfare. The period also saw the emergence of early strategic thought in Wu's court. Advisors and officials studied patterns of conflict, evaluated strengths and weaknesses of both Wu and neighboring states, and developed systematic approaches to troop deployment and battlefield tactics. Intelligence gathering and reconnaissance became integral to military planning. Leaders emphasized timing, terrain, and coordination between naval and land forces, laying the groundwork for principles that would later be codified in military texts. Wu's interactions with northern Zhou states provided additional exposure to evolving military theories. The northern states, with their larger populations and established military hierarchies, offered models of logistics, conscription, and command structure. Wu selectively adopted these practices while maintaining flexibility suited to its environment. This combination of adaptation, innovation, and observation reflects a broader pattern in Eastern Zhou China, where regional states synthesized external knowledge to enhance survival and competitiveness. Population distribution and social organization influenced military capability. Wu's ability to mobilize labor for agricultural production, infrastructure, and military service depended on administrative coordination and local governance. Communities along the Yangtze were organized to provide resources and manpower, demonstrating the integration of civil and military planning. The relationship between population management and military readiness was a defining feature of state capacity during this period. By 520 BC, Wu had become a significant power in the southeastern region, capable of engaging in both defensive and offensive operations. Its military and administrative systems provided the foundation for subsequent expansion under King Helu, who reigned later in the 6th century BC. The state's strategic position, combined with its investments in organization, training, and technology, positioned it to influence broader patterns of warfare and political interaction in Eastern Zhou China. The development of Wu during 600 to 520 BC illustrates how geography, economics, administration, and military innovation intersected to create a capable regional state. These processes were not unique to Wu, but were emblematic of a broader trend in Eastern Zhou China, in which independent states increasingly relied on structured governance, professionalized armies, and strategic planning to maintain and expand power. Wu's experiences in this period contributed to the environment in which systematic military theory could emerge, eventually informing the principles later associated with Sun Wu in the art of war. The historical figure known as Sun Wu, later referred to as Sun Tzu, emerges during the late spring and autumn period of the Eastern Zhou dynasty, specifically in the early 6th century BC. According to the Shiji, records of the Grand Historian, compiled by Sima Qian in the 1st century BC, Sun Wu served King Helu of Wu, who reigned approximately 514 to 496 BC. While details about Sun Wu's life are scarce and sometimes contradictory, the evidence indicates that he was associated with military reforms and strategic thought that would influence Chinese warfare for centuries. The state of Wu, during Sun Wu's time, was a relatively new player on the political stage of southeastern China. Its leaders had invested in administrative and military modernization, incorporating lessons from northern states and neighboring Chu. King Helu, recognizing the importance of competent military leadership, appointed advisors and generals who could organize the state's armed forces effectively. Sun Wu is believed to have been one of these figures, entrusted with the task of transforming Wu's military capacity into a disciplined and strategically capable force. Sun Wu's reforms focused on training, discipline, and organizational hierarchy. Historical accounts suggest that he emphasized rigorous troop preparation, strict adherence to command, and the cultivation of morale among soldiers. Troops were drilled in formations, coordinated maneuvers, and the proper use of weapons, including swords, spears, bows, and early crossbows. Cavalry and chariot units were also incorporated into tactical planning, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics. These measures were intended not only to increase combat effectiveness, but also to instill cohesion and reliability in Wu's army. Discipline under Sun Wu extended beyond battlefield conduct. Soldiers were expected to follow clear lines of authority, maintain equipment, and observe regulations related to logistics, supply management, and camp organization. This systematic approach contrasted with the less formalized structures of neighboring states, where aristocratic privilege often determined command rather than competence or strategic acumen. By standardizing procedures and enforcing accountability, Sun Wu contributed to a professionalization of military practice in Wu. Historical texts, including Sima Qian's account, highlight Sun Wu's emphasis on morale, order, and strategic deployment. He is said to have advocated for the careful use of intelligence and reconnaissance, understanding that knowledge of enemy positions, terrain, and resources was critical to effective decision-making. The employment of spies and scouts, coordinated troop movements, and timing of engagement were integral to his strategic philosophy. These concepts reflect principles that would later be elaborated in the 13 chapters of The Art of War, although attribution remains historically debated. Despite these detailed descriptions, Sun Wu's actual existence is complicated by the gap between the events of the early 6th century BC and the compilation of historical records centuries later. The earliest written references to Sun Wu appear long after his alleged service in Wu, creating uncertainty regarding the factual accuracy of specific anecdotes. Archaeological evidence from this period, including inscriptions, bamboo slips, and early texts, confirms the practice of military organization and strategic instruction, but direct linkage to Sun Wu himself cannot be conclusively established. Nevertheless, Sun Wu's purported contributions had tangible effects on Wu's military successes. The state achieved notable victories against neighboring powers, including Chu and Yu, demonstrating the effectiveness of disciplined troops, coordinated tactics, and strategic planning. These outcomes suggest that the reforms implemented under his guidance, whether individually attributable to him or representative of broader institutional innovation, were significant in shaping Wu's capabilities. The historical context of Sun Wu's era is crucial for understanding his role. During the spring and autumn period, regional states were characterized by frequent conflicts, shifting alliances, and competition for resources and territory. The decline of centralized Zhou authority meant that rulers relied increasingly on capable generals and advisors to manage both warfare and internal administration. Military knowledge was transmitted orally, through training, and via localized manuals, providing a practical foundation for strategic theory. Sun Wu's contributions, therefore, can be viewed as part of this broader environment of experimentation and codification of military practice. In addition to battlefield reforms, Sun Wu's period saw the integration of logistical and administrative structures into military operations. Maintaining supply lines, coordinating troop movements over difficult terrain, and ensuring provisions for extended campaigns were recognized as essential elements of successful strategy. These organizational principles reflect a shift from ad hoc military engagements towards systematic, state-supported warfare. Sun Wu's emphasis on these aspects exemplifies the increasing sophistication of Chinese military thought during this period. The timing of Sun Wu's activity coincides with broader intellectual and technological trends. Iron weaponry had become more widely adopted. Chariot warfare was still relevant, but gradually complemented by infantry and cavalry innovations, and the application of geographic knowledge to strategy was increasingly systematic. Observing these trends, Sun Wu, and contemporaneous military thinkers sought to translate practical experience into replicable principles. This focus on codification and analysis differentiates Eastern Zhou military thought from earlier ritualized or purely aristocratic forms of conflict. It is also during this period that concepts central to later military theory began to take shape. The careful assessment of strengths and weaknesses, the use of deception, the timing of attacks, and the prioritization of efficiency over brute force all reflect analytical approaches consistent with Sun Wu's attributed philosophy. While the surviving text of The Art of War postdates him by several decades or centuries, the practices implemented in Wu under King Hela demonstrate that these ideas were operationalized in real-world military contexts. Sun Wu's legacy is further complicated by the existence of Sun Bin, another strategist active in the 4th century BC, whose work and lineage may have merged with Sun Wu's in historical memory. The texts attributed to Sun Wu may therefore represent a combination of oral instruction, regional practice, and later compilation. Despite this uncertainty, the structural and tactical innovations of Wu's military during this period provide a historically verifiable context in which the art of war could have been conceptualized. By approximately 496 BC, the death of King Helu and subsequent political changes in Wu marked the end of the immediate period associated with Sun Wu. The state continued to engage in regional conflicts, but the foundational reforms in military discipline, organization, and strategy persisted. The evidence suggests that, whether as a single individual or as a representative of a broader intellectual movement, Sun Wu's influence shaped the institutional environment that enabled the codification of military principles in subsequent decades. Sun Wu's activity exemplifies the transition from practical military command to theoretical articulation. His focus on training, discipline, administration, and strategic planning reflects the demands of a fragmented and competitive political environment. These innovations demonstrate the early integration of intelligence, logistics, and tactical flexibility into state-sponsored warfare, laying the groundwork for formalized military doctrine. The state of Wu, through the reforms attributed to Sun Wu, provides a clear example of how strategy emerged as a practical and essential element of survival in Eastern Zhou China. Between 500 and 475 BC, the military practices and strategic thought developed in states like Wu began to crystallize into a coherent framework that would later be recognized as the art of war. This period corresponds to the latter part of the Spring and Autumn era, during which warfare was frequent, multi-state competition intensified, and political survival depended increasingly on strategy, intelligence, and administrative efficiency. The codification of military knowledge during this time was gradual, reflecting centuries of accumulated experience in troop organization, logistics, and battlefield tactics. The state of Wu, under successive rulers following King Helu, maintained the reforms attributed to Sun Wu. Troop training, discipline, and hierarchical command structures became institutionalized rather than dependent on the presence of a single capable leader. Units were organized according to function: infantry, chariots, and naval detachments, each trained to operate both independently and in coordination. The development of combined arms tactics, integrating these units effectively, illustrates a systematic approach to warfare that emphasizes adaptability and planning over individual heroics. Warfare during this period increasingly incorporated reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and operational planning. States deployed scouts to monitor enemy movements, collect information on terrain, and assess supply lines. Advisors analyzed this intelligence to predict enemy behavior and optimize troop deployment. This analytical approach represents a shift from spontaneous engagement to strategically planned campaigns, where victory depended on preparation, deception, and the careful allocation of resources. The codification of military knowledge was also influenced by the broader intellectual environment. During this period, Chinese thinkers were beginning to analyze human behavior, governance, and social organization systematically. Practical experiences from repeated conflicts between states such as Qi, Jin, Shu, Wu, and Yu were documented, orally transmitted, and shared among officials and military officers. These observations addressed fundamental questions of strategy: how to mobilize resources efficiently, how to exploit terrain, how to maintain morale, and how to employ deception to create advantages without engaging in unnecessary combat. Material developments supported this evolution. Iron weapons and tools became widespread, enabling the production of standardized equipment for troops and improving the capacity to supply armies during extended campaigns. The construction of fortifications, roads, and supply depots reflected an understanding of logistics as integral to military success. States increasingly recognized that control of infrastructure and the flow of resources could determine the outcome of conflicts as decisively as battlefield maneuvers. The linguistic and stylistic characteristics of surviving texts suggest that the principles now associated with the art of war were formed gradually from tactical manuals, oral instruction, and regional compilations. While the final 13-chapter structure of the work likely postdates this period, the content, emphasis on deception, assessment of terrain, intelligence use, and flexible command, aligns with operational practices observable in archaeological and historical records from the early 5th century BC. Military manuals and inscriptions indicate systematic training, codified commands, and documented procedures, which reflect the early intellectualization of warfare. Competing thinkers and states during this era contributed indirectly to the formation of doctrine. Advisors in Wu, Chu, and northern states such as Jin were experimenting with various approaches to army management, morale, and tactical deployment. The iterative nature of conflict, victories and defeats across multiple campaigns, allowed military leaders to observe patterns and refine strategies. These cumulative experiences were essential for the creation of a doctrine that could be communicated, replicated, and adapted across different contexts. Strategic thought during 500 to 475 BC emphasized efficiency and economy in conflict. The principle that engagements should minimize unnecessary losses while maximizing outcomes became increasingly recognized. Commanders were expected to choose battles carefully, manipulate enemy perceptions, and avoid confrontation when disadvantageous. The notion of subduing the opponent without combat, later central to Sun Tzu's teaching, finds its earliest practical roots in the campaigns and advisory practices of this period. The role of terrain analysis also became prominent. Military leaders understood that rivers, marshes, mountains, and plains each demanded specific tactical responses. Wu, with its riverine and marshland environment, developed expertise in adapting formations, logistics, and movement to local conditions. Northern states focused on plains and river crossings, emphasizing chariot maneuvers and rapid infantry deployment. The strategic integration of environmental knowledge into operational planning was a hallmark of emerging doctrine. By the mid-5th century BC, states were increasingly standardizing military practices, reflecting an early form of codified doctrine. Troop organization, command hierarchies, logistical procedures, and intelligence collection were being documented and taught within states. Military thought was no longer purely experiential. It was being formalized, analyzed, and communicated systematically. This intellectualization of warfare provided a foundation for later compilation into texts such as The Art of War. During this period, the distinction between practical leadership and theoretical analysis became clearer. Successful generals needed both operational competence and the ability to understand principles that could be applied across different campaigns. Advisors and scholars contributed to this by observing, recording, and debating the outcomes of engagements, producing an empirical basis for strategic reasoning. The articulation of these principles represents the early integration of practical experience with conceptual thinking, a hallmark of military doctrine. The creation of a cohesive framework for strategy between 500 and 475 BC reflects the interaction of multiple factors. The political fragmentation of Eastern Zhou, the professionalization of armies' technological and logistical advancements, and the emergence of analytical approaches to warfare. States that adapted effectively combined these elements into organized campaigns capable of both defensive and offensive operations. This integration of experience, observation, and formalization represents the historical foundation for the art of war. Even in the absence of the final written text, the military environment of Wu and other states during this period demonstrates the systematic application of strategic principles. Campaign planning, troop discipline, intelligence operations, resource management, and deception were operationalized as part of statecraft. These practices highlight that by the early 5th century BC, the intellectual groundwork for a codified approach to warfare existed, laying the basis for the compilation and later canonization of Sun Wu's teachings. The codification process was gradual and cumulative. Military knowledge was preserved in regional manuals, oral instruction, and administrative records. By consistently applying and refining these methods over decades, the Eastern Zhou states created a practical knowledge base capable of guiding strategic decisions. The principles emphasized adaptability, efficiency, and informed decision-making, reflecting a synthesis of observation, practice, and analysis that constitutes the core of the art of war. The period of 500 to 475 BC, therefore, represents the initial crystallization of military doctrine in ancient China. While Sun Wu's individual role cannot be confirmed in every detail, the practices attributed to him and implemented in Wu correspond closely to the operational and conceptual innovations of the time. These developments transformed warfare from a series of ad hoc engagements into a system of organized campaigns underpinned by observation, planning, and structured command, the essential elements of strategic doctrine that would endure in subsequent centuries. Between 475 and 400 BC, Eastern Zhou China entered the early warring states period, a phase defined by intensifying interstate competition, population growth, and increasingly complex military and political structures. The fragmentation of authority following the decline of the Zhou monarchy had persisted for centuries, and by this period, regional states such as Qi, Jin, Chu, Wu, Yu, and later Qian were firmly established, as independent powers. The constant conflict and need for survival created fertile ground for the emergence of military thinkers and strategists who sought to codify, rationalize, and debate the principles of warfare. One significant development during this period was the intellectual formalization of military strategy. Whereas earlier decades had focused on practical implementation, the organization of troops, logistics, and battlefield tactics, the early warring states period saw systematic attempts to analyze and theorize warfare. Thinkers began to examine patterns of victory and defeat, investigating not only how battles were won, but why certain approaches succeeded in specific contexts. This process reflects a growing awareness that an effective strategy could be abstracted from circumstance and applied broadly. Several notable figures exemplify the competitive intellectual environment of this period. Wu Qi, active in the mid-5th century BC, served in states such as Chu and later Wei, reforming military organization, discipline, and training. Wu Qi emphasized meritocratic leadership, strict enforcement of regulations, and rigorous preparation, advocating that strategic success depended on structured and disciplined troops rather than noble lineage alone. His writings and policies circulated widely, influencing contemporaneous and subsequent military practice. Sun Bin, believed to be a descendant or relative of Sun Wu, emerged slightly later in this era and contributed to the continuity and adaptation of Sun Wu's principles. Sun Bin is noted for practical innovations in battlefield maneuvering, use of terrain, and psychological strategy, further refining concepts of deception and intelligence in warfare. While Sun Bin's life and works post-date Sun Wu by a generation or more, the intellectual lineage connecting the two figures represents the transmission and adaptation of strategic principles across decades. Another important contributor was Mozi, a philosopher from the state of Lu, whose work on defensive warfare emphasized fortification, collective defense, and efficiency in the use of manpower. While Mozi's perspective was partially moral and ethical, advocating universal benefit and opposition to aggression, his observations on siege warfare, fortification design, and disciplined defense intersected with practical military concerns and influenced state planners. The circulation of military texts and annotations during this period facilitated intellectual competition. Advisors and generals collected, copied, and commented upon earlier treatises, including fragments attributed to Sun Wu, Wu Qi, and regional manuals. These texts were studied to understand principles of logistics, troop deployment, deception, and timing, often annotated to reflect regional variations in terrain, resources, and population. The competitive exchange of ideas fostered refinement and synthesis, with different states integrating theories into operational practice. Military engagement during this era became systematic and sustained, providing empirical foundations for strategic thought. Large-scale campaigns involved not only troop numbers, but careful planning, coordination of multiple units, and logistical support over extended periods. Intelligence gathering, scouting, and espionage became standard practice, reflecting an understanding that knowledge and timing could determine outcomes more reliably than sheer force. Observations of these practices informed debates among thinkers regarding the principles that govern success in conflict. States also experimented with administrative and organizational reforms to support strategic innovation. Population growth required more efficient conscription, taxation, and labor organization, while armies needed standardized training, equipment, and command structures. Leaders increasingly recognized that administrative capacity and strategic planning were inseparable. Victory depended as much on organizing resources effectively as on tactical execution. This integration of civil and military administration formed a central theme in the military thinking of the period. The period also saw differentiation between schools of thought. The Sun School, associated with Sun Wu's principles, emphasized deception, intelligence, flexibility, and efficiency. Wu Qi's school emphasized discipline, meritocracy, and the moral authority of the ruler to enforce compliance. Mozi highlighted defense and ethical considerations. These intellectual currents competed in the courts of various states, influencing policy, campaign planning, and military reforms. Scholars and generals adapted elements of multiple schools, producing hybrid approaches that were operationally tested in ongoing conflicts. Tactical innovation during this period was extensive. The integration of infantry, cavalry, chariots, and naval units in southern states reflected sophisticated coordination across unit types. Commanders applied principles of maneuver, surprise, and concentration of force to exploit weaknesses in opposing armies. Deception and feints were increasingly employed, informed by careful observation of enemy behavior and terrain. These practical applications reinforced the need for codified theory, as experiential knowledge alone could not ensure reproducibility across diverse campaigns and regions. Economic and logistical factors were central to military thought. Sustaining standing armies required secure agricultural production, trade for material resources, and efficient transport networks. States invested in infrastructure such as roads, river routes, and storage depots to maintain supply lines. Military thinkers analyzed the allocation of resources, the timing of campaigns relative to agricultural cycles, and the cost-benefit of prolonged engagements, integrating these considerations into strategic frameworks. By 400 BC, the intellectual and practical foundations of Chinese military strategy had become highly developed. The synthesis of observation, experience, and formal reasoning produced principles that emphasized the use of intelligence, disciplined forces, deception, terrain exploitation, and resource management. The competitive environment encouraged refinement, with states testing theories in actual campaigns and recording outcomes for future analysis. This period represents the intellectual maturation of strategic thought that would underpin the formalization of texts such as The Art of War. The rise of competing thinkers between 475 and 400 BC illustrates the interplay between practical military necessity and theoretical analysis. Empirical observation of campaigns, codification of practices, and philosophical debate combined to create a dynamic environment in which strategic principles were both tested and refined. The period highlights that the emergence of military doctrine in Eastern Zhou China was not the work of a single individual, but the product of decades of cumulative innovation and intellectual engagement, resulting in frameworks that could guide decision-making across multiple states and conflicts. Between 400 and 221 BC, the Warring States period reached its height, representing a culmination of centuries of political fragmentation, military innovation, and strategic evolution. During this era, the Chinese political landscape was dominated by 7 major states: Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin, each operating as autonomous entities with sophisticated bureaucracies, permanent armies, and complex economic systems. Warfare was no longer occasional raiding or ritualized conflict. It became a systematic, continuous process, integrating logistics, intelligence, strategy, and administration to achieve decisive outcomes. A defining characteristic of this period was the professionalization and specialization of armies. States maintained standing forces divided into infantry, cavalry, chariots, and naval units, each trained in coordinated maneuvers suited to diverse terrain. Units were further subdivided into regiments or battalions under experienced officers whose selection increasingly depended on competence rather than lineage. Meritocratic principles in command allowed capable strategists to rise, ensuring that operational planning and tactical execution were both disciplined and flexible. The professionalization extended to logistical staff, engineers, and supply managers, reflecting the complexity of year-round campaigns. Warfare was industrialized and systematized. States established arsenals for weapons and armor production, depots for food and materials, and roads or river routes for troop movements. Castles, city walls, and fortified positions became central to defense, while sieges and coordinated assaults required planning over months or years. The integration of administrative capacity with military operations created a war machine in which resource management, intelligence, and strategic planning were inseparable from battlefield performance. The role of intelligence and espionage expanded significantly. States employed networks of informants, scouts, and covert operatives to monitor enemy movements, assess morale, and identify logistical vulnerabilities. Commanders and advisors utilized this intelligence to anticipate enemy strategy, exploit weaknesses, and design feints or ambushes. The systematic collection and analysis of information became a hallmark of strategic thought, emphasizing the principle that knowledge could outweigh brute force in determining victory. During this period, strategic theory was codified and circulated. Texts attributed to Sun Wu, Wu Qi, and other military thinkers were studied, annotated, and adapted to contemporary circumstances. These works emphasized principles such as deception, concentration of force, flexibility, and the economical use of resources. Military manuals outlined procedures for troop deployment, signal communication, and logistics coordination, reflecting the increasingly institutionalized nature of warfare. The intellectualization of strategy allowed states to apply generalized principles to specific campaigns, reducing reliance on ad hoc decision-making. Economic organization was central to sustaining prolonged campaigns. Agricultural production, taxation, and trade provided the resources necessary to maintain large armies and supply extensive sieges. States invested in infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and canals to facilitate the movement of troops and supplies. Centralized administration and record-keeping allowed rulers to monitor resources, conscript soldiers efficiently, and allocate materials where they were most needed. The ability to sustain continuous operations over multiple seasons was a key determinant of military effectiveness. Population management was closely linked to military capability. States conducted censuses to determine available manpower, conscripted labor for both military and civil projects, and organized settlement patterns to maximize agricultural and strategic productivity. Training and discipline were applied systematically to conscripted and professional soldiers alike, ensuring that the quality of forces did not decline even as armies expanded in size. This integration of civil administration with military organization reflects the totalizing approach to warfare characteristic of the warring states. The period also saw the emergence of interconnected strategic networks. States engaged in diplomacy, alliances, and marriage agreements, often using these relationships to manipulate enemies and secure advantageous positions. Military thinkers advised rulers on timing campaigns relative to seasonal cycles, enemy vulnerabilities, and regional economic conditions. Strategy was increasingly informed by predictive analysis rather than reactive decision-making, illustrating the intellectual rigor underlying operational planning. Technological innovations continued to shape warfare. Iron weaponry, crossbows, and improved siege equipment enhanced offensive and defensive capabilities. Chariots, although gradually declining in dominance, were integrated with infantry and cavalry to maximize battlefield flexibility. States invested in fortification systems, river defenses, and logistics infrastructure to support prolonged campaigns. These developments illustrate the synergy between technological advancement and strategic application in the warring state's military system. During this era, battlefield tactics evolved in sophistication. Commanders used feints, ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and psychological operations to exploit enemy weaknesses. Terrain analysis became critical. Mountains, rivers, and plains dictated the choice of engagement, the deployment of units, and the logistics of supply. Coordination across multiple divisions of an army required signaling systems, pre-planned maneuvers, and adherence to strict command hierarchies. The success of campaigns depended on the integration of these factors into comprehensive operational plans. The warring states machine also institutionalized strategic education and advisory roles. Military academies, advisory councils, and mentorship systems allowed knowledge to be transmitted across generations of commanders. Texts such as The Art of War provided guiding principles, while direct observation of campaigns enabled practical learning. The combination of formal instruction, textual study, and empirical experience created a cadre of professional strategists capable of applying doctrine to diverse operational contexts. By the late 4th century BC, the warring states had perfected the integration of administration, logistics, intelligence, and strategy into a continuous system of warfare. Success in this period required understanding not only battlefield tactics, but also resource allocation, terrain exploitation, and predictive analysis of enemy behavior. The environment produced a demand for concise, adaptable, and universal strategic manuals, providing historical conditions under which the art of war and similar texts gained practical relevance. The Warring States period demonstrates that warfare had become a comprehensive state activity, encompassing military, economic, administrative, and intellectual dimensions. The operational sophistication of armies, the standardization of procedures, and the formalization of strategic thought reflect a society in which survival depended on the systematic application of knowledge. Military theory was no longer abstract. It was inseparable from the organization and functioning of the state, laying the foundation for enduring doctrines that would influence Chinese and global military practice. Between 221 and 206 BC, the state of Qin completed the unification of China, marking the transition from the Warring States period to imperial rule under the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, systematically conquered the 6 remaining rival states, Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, through a combination of sustained military campaigns, administrative efficiency, and strategic innovation. This period represents the culmination of centuries of military development in Eastern Zhou China, and it illustrates both the practical application of strategic principles and the transformative impact of centralized authority on warfare. Qian's military success was built on comprehensive organization and standardization. The state maintained a permanent, professional army, structured into divisions with clear command hierarchies. Soldiers were trained in standardized formations, weapon usage, and coordinated maneuvers. Infantry, cavalry, and chariot units were integrated to exploit combined arms tactics effectively. Standardization extended to equipment. Iron weapons, crossbows, and armor were produced in large quantities and distributed systematically, ensuring uniformity and reliability across the army. Logistics and supply were central to Qian's campaigns. The state organized extensive networks of roads, canals, and storage depots to support troop movement over long distances. Agricultural production was harnessed to maintain provisions, while administrative officials coordinated conscription, transportation, and resource allocation. This level of bureaucratic military integration allowed Qian to sustain prolonged campaigns against multiple adversaries simultaneously. Intelligence and reconnaissance were equally prioritized. Qian employed scouts, spies, and informants to monitor enemy positions, assess morale, and identify weaknesses. Commanders analyzed this information to design ambushes, encirclements, and feints. The strategic use of deception, informed by empirical observation and theoretical principles, reflects continuity with the doctrines of earlier thinkers such as Sun Wu, Wu Qi, and their intellectual successors. The conquest of rival states demonstrated the application of strategic doctrine at a macro level. Campaigns were planned years in advance, timed with seasonal conditions, and executed in phases to systematically weaken opponents. Qian utilized a combination of direct assault, siege warfare, and psychological operations to undermine enemy cohesion. Fortified positions were methodically reduced through both engineering innovation and coordinated assault, illustrating an integrated approach that combined tactical ingenuity with logistical planning. Administrative centralization under Qian also enhanced military effectiveness. Standardized laws, weights, measures, and currency facilitated economic coordination and resource mobilization. Governors and military commanders were appointed based on loyalty and competence, reinforcing the state's capacity to enforce orders and sustain campaigns. The integration of civil and military administration allowed Qian to maintain continuous operations over the vast territories required to unify China. While Qian's consolidation was militarily effective, it also involved the suppression of intellectual and cultural materials, including the burning of books considered politically or ideologically threatening. Despite this, strategic texts such as The Art of War survived, either through trusted preservation or clandestine transmission. The endurance of these works during Qian's authoritarian regime underscores their perceived value as practical guides for military and administrative conduct. The period illustrates the transformation of strategy from advisory principle to operational execution on a national scale. Principles of discipline, organization, intelligence, deception, and adaptability, previously applied in regional campaigns, were now implemented across an empire-sized theater. Commanders had to coordinate multiple armies, manage extended supply lines, and adapt doctrine to diverse geographic and demographic conditions. The integration of strategic thought into state machinery exemplifies the practical maturity of military theory by the late 3rd century BC. Technological innovation remained a significant factor. Qin engineers developed siege equipment, standardized crossbows, and iron tools for fortification construction. Cavalry and chariot units were deployed selectively, emphasizing mobility and flexibility. River and canal networks facilitated rapid troop deployment, demonstrating the interdependence of infrastructure and military capability. The combination of technological and organizational innovation enabled Qin to overpower larger or equally capable states through superior coordination and planning. The unification campaigns also emphasized psychological strategy. Qin employed methods to demoralize opponents, including isolating armies, severing supply lines, and demonstrating overwhelming force. These methods reflect the enduring influence of principles such as deception, intelligence exploitation, and calculated engagement from earlier strategic thought. Success was not based solely on numerical advantage, but on the integrated application of multiple dimensions of statecraft and military art. By 221 BC, Qin Shi Huang had completed the conquest of China, centralizing authority and establishing the Qin dynasty. While the dynasty itself was short-lived, the period demonstrates the culmination of centuries of strategic development, military institutionalization, and administrative integration. Qin's approach exemplifies the practical application of doctrines that had evolved from the Eastern Zhou period, confirming the utility and adaptability of strategic principles codified in texts such as the Art of War. The era from 221 to 206 BC represents a critical historical stage in which military doctrine became inseparable from state organization. Strategy, logistics, intelligence, and administration functioned as an integrated system, enabling sustained campaigns over extended territories. The practical implementation of strategic theory during Qin unification provides a historical precedent for the enduring relevance of principles developed and recorded in earlier centuries, linking the operational environment of the warring states to the institutional realities of imperial China. Following the collapse of the Qin dynasty in 206 BC, the establishment of the Han dynasty marked a return to stability, providing an environment in which military texts and strategic thought could be revived and systematized. During this period, the early Han rulers consolidated control over a unified China while maintaining the military innovations developed under Qin. The period also saw renewed interest in the study, preservation, and application of earlier strategic works, including the Art of War, reflecting both practical utility and intellectual continuity. The early Han state maintained a centralized bureaucratic military system. Administrative reforms facilitated the organization of conscription, resource allocation, and logistical support for both defensive and offensive operations. Standing armies were supplemented by levied troops drawn from the population, while professional officers trained in standardized formations ensured operational cohesion. The integration of civil and military administration allowed for more predictable and sustainable campaigns, continuing the systemic approach to warfare established during the late Warring States and Qin periods. Military campaigns during this period extended across the Han borders, including operations against the Xiongnu Confederation in the north and localized revolts within the empire. These campaigns emphasized strategic planning, supply chain management, and intelligence collection. The employment of scouts, spies, and reconnaissance units enabled commanders to monitor enemy movements, anticipate attacks, and exploit vulnerabilities. The practical application of these principles demonstrates the continuing relevance of doctrines attributed to Sun Wu, particularly in areas of deception, terrain analysis, and resource-efficient operations. The intellectual revival of strategic texts during the Han was facilitated by the compilation and preservation of manuscripts. Notably, between 134 and 118 BC, versions of the art of war and works attributed to Sun Bin were recorded on the Yinqueshan bamboo slips, discovered much later in archaeological excavations. These slips confirm that parts of the text had achieved a stable form by the early 2nd century BC, providing evidence that the principles attributed to Sun Wu had been transmitted, adapted, and institutionalized over several generations. The preservation of these texts indicates the practical and scholarly value placed on systematic strategic thought by Han officials and military leaders. The Han period also emphasized the formal study of military doctrine. Advisors and generals were expected to master established principles of troop organization, battlefield maneuvering, logistics, and intelligence. Military academies and training programs incorporated canonical texts alongside practical experience, fostering a professional cadre capable of applying strategy consistently across varied operational contexts. This structured approach reflects the maturation of military education and the integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application. Strategic thinking during this period highlighted several enduring principles. Deception was employed to mislead opponents and create opportunities for tactical advantage. Flexibility allowed commanders to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield or in the broader operational theater. Campaign economy, or the efficient use of troops and resources, was central to sustaining prolonged operations, particularly in remote or hostile regions. Terrain analysis remained critical as commanders leveraged mountains, rivers, and plains to maximize the effectiveness of their forces. These principles, preserved in the art of war, continued to inform both practical military planning and scholarly debate. The Han also systematized logistics and supply management to an unprecedented degree. Agricultural production was organized to support garrisons and expeditionary forces, while storage facilities and transport networks enabled the movement of provisions over considerable distances. Record-keeping allowed administrators to track troop strength, supply inventories, and campaign expenditures, ensuring that strategic planning was informed by accurate data. The institutionalization of logistics reflects a continuity with Qian practices and underscores the integration of operational, administrative, and intellectual components of military strategy. During the Han, cross-cultural transmission of strategic knowledge began to take form. Diplomatic missions, trade, and military engagement with neighboring states and nomadic confederations created opportunities for observation and adaptation of foreign practices. The exchange of tactical information and the adaptation of external concepts to Chinese contexts reinforced the adaptability and universality of the strategic principles codified in texts such as the Art of War. The period also saw the adaptation of historical doctrine to new political conditions. Whereas the Warring States period had emphasized competition among multiple independent states, the Han faced the challenge of defending a vast, unified empire. Strategic principles were therefore applied to both internal control and frontier defense. The ability to adjust previously established doctrines to new political realities reflects the enduring flexibility and relevance of Sun Wu's attributed teachings. The preservation of manuscripts and annotations during this period contributed to the establishment of a scholarly tradition surrounding military texts. Commentaries and marginalia allowed practitioners to interpret principles in the context of contemporary campaigns, ensuring that strategic knowledge remained relevant and applicable. The systematic study and annotation of these texts formed the foundation for later canonization in the Six Dynasties and Song periods. By 100 BC, the Han Dynasty had firmly established both practical and intellectual frameworks for military strategy. The rediscovery and documentation of the art of war and related texts on bamboo slips provide the earliest tangible evidence of the text's existence, confirming that the strategic principles attributed to Sun Wu were not merely anecdotal, but embedded in the practice of statecraft and warfare. These developments demonstrate that centuries of observation, reform, and codification had produced a robust body of knowledge that continued to guide military organization, campaign planning, and strategic reasoning. Between 100 BC and 960 AD, the art of war transitioned from a practical military guide to a formally recognized canonical text, reflecting both its sustained utility and the evolving intellectual environment of China. Following the Han Dynasty, successive periods, including the Six Dynasties, 220 to 589 AD, Sui, 581 to 618 AD, Tang, 618 to 907 AD, and early Song, 960 AD, witnessed significant developments in military thought, scholarship, and institutional education, all of which contributed to the codification and canonical status of strategic texts. After 100 BC, the Han state had already established practical applications of Sun Wu's principles. In the subsequent centuries, military scholars and officials began systematically commenting, annotating, and transmitting these texts. These commentaries served multiple purposes: clarifying obscure passages, reconciling contradictions, contextualizing principles for contemporary military challenges, and providing case studies from recent campaigns. The process of commentary was both scholarly and pragmatic, ensuring that the text remained relevant to evolving operational realities. During the Six Dynasties period, 220 to 589 AD, China experienced political fragmentation and frequent warfare among competing states. This instability increased the demand for strategic guidance, encouraging military thinkers to study earlier texts critically. Advisors and generals compared Sun Wu's principles with those of contemporaries, integrating lessons from regional conflicts. The act of annotation and interpretation became essential, as it allowed military leaders to adapt centuries-old doctrine to rapidly changing tactical, technological, and political circumstances. The Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 AD, represents a period of consolidation in both military and intellectual spheres. Tang rulers maintained standing armies and a professional officer corps, while strategic treatises were formally studied and disseminated in military academies. Scholars produced extensive commentaries on the art of war, often referencing historical campaigns to illustrate practical applications. The Tang period emphasized systematic military education, ensuring that command staff understood principles such as troop discipline, logistical planning, intelligence gathering, deception, and terrain analysis. These principles, codified centuries earlier, were now taught in structured institutional settings. The transmission of the art of war during this period also extended geographically. The text reached neighboring states such as Korea and Japan, often via Confucian and Buddhist scholars accompanying diplomatic missions or serving in official capacities. In each context, scholars annotated and adapted the text, providing explanations that reconciled classical Chinese strategic thought with local military practices. These adaptations contributed to the text's longevity and reinforced its status as a foundational work in East Asian military theory. The establishment of the 7 military classics during the early Song dynasty, c. 960 AD, formally canonized the art of war. This collection included texts spanning several centuries, selected for their enduring relevance and intellectual rigor. Canonization involved not only preservation but also institutional endorsement. Military academies adopted these works as part of standardized curricula, ensuring that officers and scholars were trained in a consistent strategic framework. The inclusion of the art of war among the 7 military classics solidified its authority as a central reference for military education, administration, and advisory functions. The process of canonization was accompanied by philological analysis and textual criticism. Scholars compared surviving manuscripts, including the Yinqueshan bamboo slips, with later copies and commentaries. Variants were noted, and authoritative editions were established. These scholarly efforts ensured that the text retained coherence and utility, while also allowing adaptation to changing political and military contexts. The systematic approach to textual preservation highlights the intersection of military practice, intellectual activity, and bureaucratic administration. Strategic principles articulated in the art of war, such as deception, speed, flexibility, concentration of force, terrain evaluation, and understanding both self and opponent, were repeatedly emphasized in commentaries and teaching. Military instructors incorporated historical examples from the warring states, Han and Tang campaigns, providing empirical grounding for theoretical concepts. This ensured that the text remained practically relevant, linking centuries-old doctrine to contemporary operational challenges. The period also witnessed the development of professional military literature, influenced by the art of war and other canonical texts. Manuals, case studies, and tactical treatises were produced to address emerging technologies, fortification methods, and organizational innovations. These works frequently cited Sun Tzu, reinforcing the enduring authority of his principles and establishing a lineage of military thought extending across multiple dynasties. Throughout 100 BC to 960 AD, the text transmission demonstrates a pattern of incremental preservation, annotation, and institutionalization. The combination of practical application, scholarly commentary, and canonical recognition ensured that the art of war survived periods of political upheaval, cultural change, and technological evolution. Its integration into military education and state administration reflects a continuous valuation of its strategic principles across both practical and intellectual domains. By the early Song dynasty, the art of war had achieved both practical utility and intellectual authority, bridging the gap between operational military practice and systematic scholarly study. The text was no longer simply a guide for battlefield decision-making, but had become an established reference in military thought, forming part of a standardized educational and advisory framework that shaped Chinese military culture for centuries. The art of war encapsulates a systematic philosophy of warfare developed over centuries of observation, practice, and theoretical refinement. By the time it achieved canonical recognition, its principles reflected the accumulated knowledge of multiple generations of Chinese military thought, particularly from the Eastern Zhou, Warring States, Qian, and early Han periods. The text emphasizes the structured interaction between strategic planning, operational execution, and state administration, highlighting that effective warfare relies on disciplined organization and rigorous understanding rather than mere chance or brute force. A core principle is the use of deception. Commanders are instructed to obscure their intentions, present misleading maneuvers, and create uncertainty in the enemy's decision-making. This is not framed as a moral prescription, but as a practical instrument to increase the probability of operational success. Historical campaigns from the Warring States to Han illustrate consistent application. Feints, ambushes, and surprise attacks were designed to exploit predictable patterns in enemy behavior while minimizing direct risk to one's forces. Speed and timing are also fundamental. Rapid mobilization, flexible response, and synchronized operations allow forces to seize initiative and dictate the pace of engagement. Early Chinese military theorists observed that delays, whether logistical, administrative, or due to poor communication, frequently led to failure. Effective generals aligned troop movements with seasonal and environmental factors, ensuring that campaigns coincided with favorable conditions and resource availability. The text emphasizes flexibility and adaptability. Commanders must adjust plans in response to changing terrain, enemy disposition, morale, and logistical constraints. Static adherence to preconceived strategies was recognized as a common cause of defeat. Across the historical record, from Warring States campaigns to Han frontier operations, successful generals combined planning with the capacity to respond dynamically, applying principles that could be generalized but not rigidly imposed. Economy of force, or the efficient allocation of resources, is another central concept. Armies must be provisioned without overextending supply lines, and campaigns must balance objectives against available manpower, material, and time. Historical accounts show that states capable of maintaining prolonged operations, such as Qin during unification campaigns or Han during northern frontier expeditions, relied on rigorous logistical planning, demonstrating the practical value of Sun Tzu's guidance. Terrain analysis is integral to the philosophy. Commanders are expected to understand the influence of geographic features on movement, engagement, and supply. Mountains, rivers, plains, and fortifications are not merely obstacles, but strategic variables to be exploited or mitigated. Historical campaigns document systematic selection of battle sites, positioning of forces, and use of environmental conditions to maximize advantage while minimizing risk. A further principle is self-knowledge and understanding of the enemy. Intelligence gathering, through scouts, spies, and informants, forms the empirical basis for strategy. Commanders are advised to assess both their own strengths and weaknesses and those of opponents, integrating this knowledge into operational planning. Historical examples demonstrate that careful analysis of enemy disposition, supply, and morale frequently determined outcomes more reliably than sheer numerical superiority. The art of war also codifies the relationship between military operations and state governance. Effective warfare is inseparable from administrative capacity. The ability to mobilize, provision, and coordinate forces depends on bureaucratic efficiency. states that successfully integrated military and civil administration, Qin and Han being primary examples, were able to sustain prolonged campaigns, standardize troop training, and enforce strategic discipline. This principle situates warfare within the broader context of governance and resource management. Commanders are instructed to maintain discipline and morale among troops. The text prescribes clear hierarchies, standardized procedures, and consistent enforcement of regulations. Historical records from the warring states indicate that disciplined armies under competent leadership were more effective than larger, less organized forces. Training, order, and adherence to command structures are presented as essential to operational success, reinforcing the text's emphasis on structure over improvisation. Finally, the philosophy recognizes the interdependency of principles. Deception, speed, flexibility, terrain, intelligence, discipline, and economy of force are not discrete concepts but components of a coherent strategic system. Effective implementation requires understanding how these elements interact, how adjustments in one domain influence others, and how the integrated application determines outcomes. The enduring historical relevance of these principles reflects their empirical validation across multiple centuries and political contexts. By codifying these principles, the art of war provides a framework for strategic reasoning that transcends individual campaigns or political conditions. It serves as both a practical manual and a theoretical guide, linking tactical decisions to operational objectives and integrating military practice with state administration. The philosophy of war embedded in the text represents a cumulative synthesis of historical observation, systematic reflection, and codified strategic thought developed from 771 BC through the Han Dynasty. Between 1000 and 1800 AD, the art of war expanded beyond the borders of China, reaching neighboring East Asian states and, eventually, Europe. The text's transmission reflects a combination of scholarly, diplomatic, and commercial activity, demonstrating both the adaptability of Sun Tzu's principles and their continued relevance to evolving military and political contexts. This period highlights the globalization of Chinese military thought and the early integration of strategic doctrine into diverse cultures. In East Asia, the text reached Korea, Japan, and Vietnam primarily through the movement of Confucian and Buddhist scholars, government officials, and military advisors. In Korea, the art of war was incorporated into the educational curriculum for military officers, influencing tactical training and fortification design. Japanese samurai and shogunate advisors studied the text to improve campaign planning, troop deployment, and castle defense strategies. Adaptations in each context reflected local terrain, troop composition, and political structure while maintaining the core principles of deception, flexibility, intelligence, and resource economy. During this period, military commentaries and annotated editions proliferated. Scholars and generals recorded observations from regional campaigns, aligning historical outcomes with the principles articulated in the art of war. These texts were studied in military academies and by private advisors, reinforcing a culture of empirical evaluation and strategic reasoning. The incorporation of local case studies demonstrates the practical application of the text and its integration into institutionalized military education across East Asia. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the art of war had been introduced to Europe, largely through Jesuit missionaries, traders, and scholars engaged in China. Jesuits translated parts of the text into Latin and other European languages, presenting Sun Wu's principles as both practical military guidance and a window into Chinese governance and philosophy. European officers and statesmen examined the text for insights into organization, logistics, intelligence, and strategy. The translation and study of these works contributed to early comparative military theory, influencing European military thought and campaigns that required coordination, discipline, and strategic planning. The European reception of the art of war also reflects the text's conceptual universality. Despite differences in cultural, technological, and political contexts, the principles of deception, adaptability, economy of force, and intelligence proved applicable to European military conditions. Commanders recognized the value of integrating strategic theory with battlefield practice, while scholars appreciated the systematic reasoning underlying Sun Wu's work. This early cross-cultural transmission set the stage for the text's later influence in global military and political thought. Trade and diplomatic exchange further facilitated the text's spread. Manuscripts and translations were carried along maritime and overland routes connecting China with Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. These networks enabled scholars and military practitioners to access, interpret, and adapt strategic principles for local operational requirements. The text's circulation illustrates that military knowledge in pre-modern societies was not confined by national boundaries, but could traverse cultures and linguistic traditions when its utility was recognized. In East Asia, practical applications remained prominent. Korean generals adapted Sun Wu's teachings for defensive fortifications and siege warfare, integrating them with native martial traditions. Japanese military schools incorporated the text into samurai training, emphasizing principles of terrain, timing, and intelligence. Vietnamese strategists applied concepts of deception, mobility, and economy of force to campaigns against rival states and colonial incursions. Across these regions, the text functioned both as a manual for operational guidance and a reference for scholarly debate on military organization and strategy. European engagement with the text emphasized administrative and strategic principles applicable to state building and large-scale campaign management. Officers studying Sun Wu's work noted its emphasis on disciplined organization, centralized command, and coordinated logistics. These principles informed European approaches to modernizing armies, managing garrisons, and planning multi-front campaigns. The text's European reception demonstrates its adaptability to contexts far removed from its original warring state's environment while retaining the rigor of its analytical framework. The period also witnessed the integration of Sun Wu's principles into broader intellectual discourse. Philosophers, diplomats, and political theorists cited the text in discussions of governance, power, and human behavior. Strategic thinking was no longer confined to military circles. It became a component of scholarly analysis on statecraft, negotiation, and international relations. This interdisciplinary application ensured the continued relevance of the art of war beyond immediate battlefield concerns. By 1800 AD, the art of war had achieved a global presence. It was studied in East Asia as a core component of military education, referenced in European military and political circles, and preserved in manuscript form across multiple languages and regions. Its diffusion demonstrates that the principles codified over centuries, from the Eastern Zhou through the Han, were not only empirically validated but also intellectually portable, capable of guiding strategy across diverse historical, geographic, and cultural contexts. The period from 1000 to 1800 AD establishes the art of war as a text of enduring practical and intellectual value. Its transmission, adaptation, and institutional integration illustrate the resilience of Sun Wu's principles and their capacity to inform both localized military practice and global strategic thinking. From 1800 to the present, the art of war transitioned from a primarily military text to a multidisciplinary source of strategic insight, influencing warfare, diplomacy, business, and leadership theory worldwide. Its principles, developed between 771 BC and 100 BC, retain practical relevance through modern conflicts and organizational challenges, reflecting the enduring applicability of its systematic approach to strategy, logistics, intelligence, and resource management. During the 19th century, European military theorists engaged with the art of war as part of broader studies of comparative military history. Napoleon-era generals, Prussian officers, and British strategists examined Sun Wu's principles alongside Western tactical doctrines, emphasizing the universality of strategy, the importance of intelligence, and the integration of administrative and military functions. European scholars recognized that principles such as deception, rapid maneuver, flexibility, and terrain evaluation could enhance operational planning beyond the specific historical context of ancient China. In East Asia, the text continued to influence military reform and modernization. Japanese strategists during the late Edo and early Meiji periods incorporated Sun Wu's teachings into curricula for officers, emphasizing both theoretical instruction and practical application. The adoption of these principles was part of broader modernization programs, which integrated Western technology with classical Chinese strategic thought, illustrating the compatibility of Sun Wu's methods with evolving military science. The 20th century saw the application of the art of war in revolutionary, national, and global conflicts. Chinese military leaders, most notably Mao Zedong, drew explicitly on Sun Wu's emphasis on intelligence, mobility, and strategic initiative in the context of guerrilla warfare and large-scale revolutionary campaigns. Mao adapted these principles to asymmetric conflict, demonstrating their flexibility in addressing operational challenges distinct from those of conventional ancient warfare. Other military leaders worldwide, including during World Wars I and II, recognized the relevance of strategic principles such as concentration of force, deception, and operational tempo. Parallel to its military application, the text gained prominence in business, organizational, and political strategy. Management theorists, corporate trainers, and leadership consultants applied Sun Wu's principles to competitive environments, emphasizing planning, resource allocation, timing, and analysis of competitors. Deception and intelligence were reinterpreted as market analysis and strategic positioning, while adaptability and economy of force were reframed as efficient organizational management. This expansion into non-military domains reflects the enduring conceptual clarity and universality of the text. Academically, the art of war became the subject of comparative historical, linguistic, and philosophical study. Scholars examined its historical context, textual transmission, and influence on East Asian and global strategic thought. Archaeological discoveries, including the Yinqueshan bamboo slips from the Han Dynasty, provided empirical grounding for studies of the text's development, reaffirming the historical continuity of its principles. Linguistic and philological analyses traced the evolution of terminology and instructional style, demonstrating the consolidation of military thought from regional manuals to a coherent canonical text. Modern editions and translations facilitated global accessibility, enabling scholars, military practitioners, and general readers to engage with the text across cultural and linguistic boundaries. English, French, German, Russian, and Japanese editions allowed comparative study with Western military doctrine, emphasizing principles such as operational planning, intelligence integration, resource economy, and leadership discipline. These translations also enabled applications beyond military contexts, reinforcing the text's role as a guide to rational, analytical, and adaptable decision-making. Technological and geopolitical changes in the modern era highlighted specific aspects of Sun Tzu's thought. Rapid communication, mechanized mobility, and global supply networks emphasize the continued relevance of speed, flexibility, and logistical coordination. Deception and intelligence evolved into reconnaissance, signal monitoring, and strategic planning in modern military campaigns. Commanders and analysts recognized that principles formulated in the 5th century BC China could provide enduring insight into operational art, planning methodology, and decision-making under uncertainty. The application of the art of war in leadership and management theory also underscores its analytical and systemic approach. Organizational leaders use the text to structure teams, allocate resources, anticipate competitor behavior, and adapt to changing market conditions. Principles of adaptability, foresight, and information analysis, rooted in historical campaigns and codified in Sun Tzu's doctrines, translate into frameworks for effective contemporary leadership, reflecting the text's continued intellectual and practical relevance. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the art of war had achieved global recognition as both a historical document and a practical guide. Military academies, business schools, and leadership programs routinely incorporate their principles, emphasizing the integration of strategic analysis with operational execution. The text's historical origins, spanning 771 BC to 100 BC, anchor its authority in empirical observation, while its abstract principles ensure adaptability to modern circumstances, from high-level military operations to organizational and competitive strategy. Between 771 BC and 100 BC, the historical development of the art of war reflects both the transformation of Chinese warfare and the institutionalization of strategic thought. This period encompasses the fragmentation following the Western Zhou collapse, the rise of competing states during the Eastern Zhou and warring states periods, the emergence of Sun Tzu as a military strategist, and the stabilization and preservation of his teachings in early Han China. Analysis of these centuries allows historians to distinguish verifiable developments from later mythologizing, providing a framework for understanding the text's enduring influence. The collapse of the Western Zhou dynasty in 771 BC initiated an era of political decentralization, in which regional lords exercised autonomous military and administrative authority. The resulting conflicts necessitated systematic approaches to organization, logistics, and command. Over successive decades, states such as Qi, Jin, Chu, Wu, and Yu developed permanent armies, refined conscription and training, and experimented with technologies such as iron weaponry, crossbows, and chariot integration. These innovations created an environment in which strategic reasoning became not merely theoretical but essential for survival. The period between 520 BC and 475 BC, during which Sun Wu is traditionally placed, represents the crystallization of these practices into an articulated set of doctrines. While historical records are limited and rely primarily on sources such as Sima and Shiji, the context indicates that military leaders increasingly emphasized disciplined training, hierarchical command, coordinated maneuvers, and intelligence gathering. Sun Wu's contribution, whether as a single author or as the codifier of broader regional practices, lies in synthesizing these elements into a coherent framework, formalized in the art of war through principles that could be taught, adapted, and applied. During the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC, strategic thought evolved in response to systemic changes in warfare. States adopted year-round campaigns, integrated fortifications and logistics into operational planning, and developed both offensive and defensive doctrines that required centralized coordination. This era saw the proliferation of military texts, reflecting debates among contemporary thinkers such as Wu Qi, Sun Bin, and Mozi. These works, along with the evolving versions of the art of war, illustrate an empirical approach to strategy, emphasizing observation, analysis, and disciplined implementation rather than intuition or superstition. The Qin unification, 221 to 206 BC, exemplifies the operational application of these doctrines. Qin's systematic integration of administration, logistics, and military organization demonstrates that strategic principles codified during the Warring States period were practical instruments of statecraft. Even under authoritarian suppression of texts, the art of war survived, suggesting its utility as a practical manual and its entrenched presence within military practice. In the early Han Dynasty, 206 to 100 BC, the text was stabilized and preserved, as evidenced by the Yinqueshan bamboo slips, which include portions of the art of war alongside related works attributed to Sun Bin. These finds confirm that by the 2nd century BC, the text had achieved a form suitable for institutional use, teaching, and reference. This archaeological evidence provides the earliest concrete proof of its existence and reinforces the connection between theoretical principles and the operational realities of early imperial China. Throughout this period, certain elements of the art of war were consistently emphasized: discipline, intelligence, deception, adaptability, economy of force, and terrain analysis. These principles were grounded in observable military outcomes and institutional practices rather than philosophical abstraction. Historical campaigns demonstrate that commanders who applied these principles systematically often succeeded in securing both immediate tactical advantage and long-term strategic objectives. The textual and operational development of the art of war during 771 to 100 BC illustrates the coevolution of theory and practice. Strategy was tested in repeated campaigns, refined through institutional implementation, and transmitted through both oral instruction and written records. While the identity of Sun Wu as a historical individual remains partially obscured by temporal distance, the intellectual lineage attributed to him is verifiable through both textual and archaeological evidence. The legacy of this period is the establishment of a codified, empirically grounded body of military knowledge. It represents the transformation of reactive, ad hoc conflict management into a proactive, analytical, and institutionalized strategy. The principles formulated in this era were sufficiently robust to survive dynastic changes, political upheaval, and geographical expansion, ultimately forming the foundation for centuries of military education, scholarly commentary, and global application. By examining the period from 771 BC to 100 BC, historians can trace a verifiable arc: the transition from fragmentation to codification, the emergence of disciplined strategic practice, and the preservation of doctrinal knowledge in forms suitable for instruction and application. The textual and operational continuity evident in this era underscores the historical validity of the art of war as both a practical manual and an intellectual achievement, anchoring its enduring influence in concrete, observable developments rather than legend or speculation. The period from 771 BC to 100 BC represents the formative centuries in which the art of war emerged, evolved, and stabilized, yet its influence extends far beyond the temporal boundaries of its original context. The epilogue examines how strategic thought, codified during the Eastern Zhou, warring states, Qian, and early Han periods, created an intellectual framework that transcended dynastic cycles and geographic limitations, shaping military and political reasoning for millennia. The principle that strategy outlives individual states is evident in the continuity of the art of war's application across diverse historical circumstances. States such as Wu and Chu, later unified under Qian and Han authority, demonstrated the practical relevance of strategic doctrine through campaign planning, resource management, and coordinated administration. By documenting and systematizing principles of deception, flexibility, terrain exploitation, intelligence, and logistical efficiency, the text provided tools for decision-making that were independent of any particular ruler or political structure. Even as dynasties rose and fell, the intellectual lineage of Sun Wu persisted through preservation in manuscript form, commentaries, and institutional teaching. The Yinqueshan bamboo slips, dating from 134 to 118 BC, confirmed that by the early Han dynasty, the text had achieved a stabilized form suitable for both scholarly study and operational application. These artifacts provide material evidence of an enduring strategic methodology, bridging the gap between theoretical instruction and battlefield implementation. The adaptability of the art of war contributed to its resilience. Its principles were neither rigid prescriptions nor culturally contingent rituals. Rather, they were analytical frameworks that allowed commanders, advisors, and statesmen to assess variable conditions and respond effectively. Historical application demonstrates that strategic reasoning, when codified, transmitted, and institutionalized, can operate independently of technological, social, or political change. The text structure, emphasizing causal relationships, contingency planning, and empirical observation, accounts for its longevity. Following its initial codification, the text was continuously interpreted and reinterpreted. Commentators during the Six Dynasties, Tang, and Song periods integrated historical examples to reinforce theoretical principles, while East Asian scholars in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam adapted their lessons to local military conditions. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European translation introduced Sun Wu's strategic framework to a broader international audience, demonstrating the universality of its analytical approach. The epilogue also reflects on the text's role as a tool for intellectual continuity. While individual leaders, states, and cultures may rise and fall, strategic principles endure when codified in durable forms. The systematic organization of knowledge, evident in training manuals, commentaries, and canonical collections such as the 7 military classics, ensured that successive generations could access, analyze, and apply centuries of accumulated operational experience. In essence, the intellectual achievement represented by the art of war is the establishment of a methodical, empirical, and adaptable framework for understanding conflict. Its longevity demonstrates that strategic thought, when anchored in observation and institutionalized transmission, can persist independently of its original context, influencing military, political, and organizational decision-making across temporal and cultural boundaries. The historical arc from 771 BC to 100 BC illustrates not only the formation and stabilization of the art of war, but also the broader principle that ideas endure beyond the lifespan of empires. The codification of strategic knowledge provided a foundation for centuries of scholarship, practical application, and cross-cultural transmission. Through these centuries, the text evolved from the military manuals and oral instruction of regional states into a universal reference for strategy, capable of guiding decisions in both military and non-military domains. By anchoring its analysis in empirical observation, administrative integration, and systematic reasoning, the art of war demonstrates that strategic doctrine is not merely a historical artifact, but a living intellectual tool. Its survival and adaptation across centuries, continents, and domains underscore the enduring value of structured, analytical, and contextually adaptable thought. The mind behind these principles, whether singular or collective, outlived the empires in which it originated, confirming the lasting impact of disciplined strategic reasoning and the universality of the lessons recorded in the text.